Thanks everyone for coming to this special event. It's co-sponsored by CSAC and the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. We're fortunate to have today Josh Busby, who's a professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, at University of Texas, Austin. So Josh works on a lot of different topics, many of them related to issues of climate. Some of his research is dealing with clean energy transitions. He does work on public opinion in U.S. foreign policy. And he's also been a longtime contributor to this literature on climate and security, which is the topic of his talk today. So I think Josh is going to be telling us about some draft chapters of a book that he's writing on this topic. So take it away.
All right. Thanks, Ken. Delighted to be here. So the title of the talk is Drought in the Middle East, Contrasting Fortunes in Syria and Lebanon. And I wanted to give you some intuitions. This will be hard to read at a distance, but there are two contrasting quotes, one from a paper from Colin Kelly and colleagues that make the connection between the droughts that happened in Syria in the 2006 to 2010 period, and between that drought and agricultural production decline, mass migration, and the conflict. So they say our thesis that drought contributed to the conflict in Syria draws support from recent literature establishing a statistical link between climate and conflict. On the other hand, you have Jan Selby and colleagues in 2017 saying, amongst other things, their paper shows that there's no clear and reliable evidence that anthropogenic climate change was a factor in Syria's drought, that the drought did not cause anywhere near the scale of migration that is often alleged, and that there's no solid evidence that drought migration pressures in Syria contributed to civil war onset. And so you have these kind of conflicting views in this literature on climate security, and on some level it underscores a problem that the literature has long faced on the qualitative side of these single cases where authors are either striving to make the case that climate is linked to conflict or that it's not. And that comes down to debates about relative causal weight for which qualitative methods aren't especially well suited. And this leads me back to the thesis that Mark Levy levied back in the mid-1990s in reaction to the first literature on environmental security that Tad Homer-Dixon and others had started, in which those papers, for people who are familiar, were single cases that were trying to elucidate the connections between environmental change and conflict. And they suffered from this problem that Mark Levy talked about. The more logical research strategy under the circumstances would be to compare societies facing similar environmental problems but exhibiting different levels of conflict. That would permit some precision in identifying the conditions under which environmental degradation generates violent conflict and when it does not. And that sort of underscores the motivation for this project and this chapter that is circulated today on Syria and Lebanon, that we need to try and understand the scope conditions for when climate-related changes lead to negative security outcomes. So I want to talk a little bit about the motivations for this project and the empirical chapter in more detail. For people who are familiar with my work, I've been writing on climate security since 2004 for both academic audiences and policy audiences. I was part of two Department of Defense funded research initiatives under the Minerva project, one on climate change and African political stability, more recently one on complex emergencies and political stability in Asia. And I'm also affiliated with the Center for Climate and Security. And so this literature on climate security that emerged in the kind of 2007 period and on has mostly focused on whether proxies for climate change lead to armed conflict. And that has a number of deficiencies in my view. One, there's been insufficient attention to causal mechanisms. So there's been important work, I think, by folks in this room looking at the quantitative data, assessing the correlations between climate change and conflict outcomes. But again, there hasn't been enough attention to causal mechanisms, and the sort of qualitative cases, such as they are in this field, have been those single cases that haven't allowed us to identify the scope conditions connecting cause and effect. And in my view, as I've written for a long time, security is broader than conflict. It is not simply about conflict outcomes, but there are other problems like humanitarian emergencies that also ought to be rightly considered as security problems. So this book project, States of Nature, after the colon, tries to lay out a general argument for under what conditions we'd expect to see negative security outcomes associated with climate change. I do so with qualitative methods of paired cases. And to do that, I try to unpack the causal mechanisms connecting climate changes to these negative security outcomes. And I also seek to broaden our understanding of security. And I want to do so in a way that has broader geographic coverage than this field to date, which is overwhelmingly focused on sub-Saharan Africa. So the outline for the project has an introduction, which I circulated today, 2 conceptual chapters, and then 3 empirical chapters, one comparing Somalia and Ethiopia, why famine in one and not the other, the Middle East chapter that you have, or maybe some of you saw today, although that just got loaded a little bit more recently online, and then another chapter on humanitarian emergency outcomes after cyclones in Myanmar, Bangladesh, and India, and then the 2 chapters that I have yet to write, which are more policy-oriented, why might other states care, and what we ought to do given this knowledge going forward. So I want to say a little bit more about how we think about, or how I think about, security threats. In the kind of conventional parlance of old, it was armed external attack by states against other states. That's evolved as we've seen the rise of non-state actors. It becomes security risks in their own right. But we also have to broaden our notion of security to think about forces that may not have human agency behind them, but rise to the level of security threats. And they might rise to the level of security threats that include but aren't limited to conflict. And so I think what distinguishes security threats is not human agency, but it's the scale and severity of the damage. And so large-scale loss of life, in my view, is rises to the level of security threats, and it rises to the level also because traditional security actors are often mobilized for humanitarian rescue, and so there are the opportunity costs of having to mobilize them and divert their attention from their core security tasks of fighting and winning wars to humanitarian rescue either at home or abroad. But these kinds of security problems, whether or not they escalate into conflict, also pose legitimation challenges for different governments around the world. So my work tries to broaden the notion of security, but do so in a way that conventional security practitioners and scholars would find recognizable. So I don't go full sort of human security in the definitional approach. And that leads me to the research question that I explore in this book and chapter: under what conditions will climate hazards change lead to negative security outcomes? And so I want to walk you through the argument in brief and then unpack it. And so the argument is a combination of capacity, inclusion, and assistance. And so the 3 pieces are: first, states with low capacity will have more trouble responding to climate hazards. The second is that states with politically exclusive regimes are less likely to respond to climate hazards with support for all at-risk groups. And the third is assistance. International assistance can, on some level, compensate for lack of capacity in states, but states that block foreign aid or allocate it in a biased manner are likely to have worse outcomes. So let me say a little bit more about each of those components and the inspiration for them. So in terms of capacity, states need to be able to mobilize resources and carry out service delivery to prepare for and respond to climate hazards. So less capable states can't do that. And state capacity is also important for repressing violence. And so here I'm drawing on notions of infrastructural power by Dr. Fukuyama here at Stanford and other folks in this space. The second dimension of the argument talks about political inclusion. And this isn't necessarily new to this literature per se. Other folks, both in this field and beyond, like Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, have written about political exclusion. Douglas North has written about similar ideas. Colin Call, who's here at Stanford, has also written along similar lines. Cullen Hendricks, Nina von Exkuller, others. And the idea is that exclusive regimes leave key groups out of decision making, and they're more likely to either ignore or discriminate against certain groups. And it's also, I think, true that if we conceive of governance and stability in most states as sort of elite packs of different groups in society, if some groups are systematically excluded, that's more likely to lead to violent breakdown. And those on some level are familiar pieces that have emerged as core insights from the climate and security literature. I think what's missing is the dimension of ways in which international interlocutors can either accentuate or attenuate some of these risks through policies and interventions of their own. And so here I bring in a dimension about foreign aid that includes both overseas development assistance, but also humanitarian assistance, which aren't always tracked in the same budgets, and that on some level can compensate for state weakness in times of need, although it depends on how it's allocated. So it intersects with these other forces. So my expectations are the worst case scenarios are ones of low capacity states with high political exclusion that block foreign aid or distribute it in a one-sided manner. And the best case scenarios are ones of high capacity states with high political inclusion who receive aid and distribute it broadly to all social groups. And that leads me to try to make some tentative kind of causal diagrams, although they may be problematic. But the base one, and that's more relevant for other chapters, not this one, is you have a climate hazard, it intersects with capacity inclusion and assistance, and then you either get a humanitarian emergency or you don't. Now, we have a more complex causal chain to get to conflict, and get to conflict in this case. So you have a climate hazard, it intersects with these other forces, but it also intersects with agricultural production, may lead to migration, suffering and grievances, contestation for resources, competition, maybe state suppression, and ultimately get to civil conflict. And so the task for a chapter like this one on Syria and Lebanon that, at least in the Syrian case, ends in conflict is I have to trace all those linkages along the causal chain and also show what forces in, say, the Lebanese context attenuated those outcomes, so didn't lead to conflict in one case and not the other. So the method for this work is comparative cases, case study. In other chapters, I exploit within case variation. So, you know, Ethiopia had a drought in the 80s, but didn't in 2015. I don't do that in this chapter, but I do that in some of the other cases. I need to document that both of the countries of comparison faced a similar climate hazard. And then I need to code the key variables for capacity, inclusion, and assistance and show how they differ on the ways that I expect. And then tie that together in a causal pathway in a neat or messy bow, however it may be. And then also address alternative explanations so that I'm not just fixing the evidence around my preferred argument. And case selection is really important here. Trying to think about cases that are alike enough in many respects is hard. No cases in this world are perfect cases, as I labored mightily to think about. I want them to be alike enough in terms of maybe weather and precipitation and maybe the growing environment for agriculture, maybe alike enough in some measure of ethnic fragmentation, something about their history, maybe shared historical experience on some level. And then other key dimensions that I thought about in case selection were the degree of agricultural dependence. So in 2008, about 13.5% of Lebanon's workforce was still employed in agriculture, and about 17.5% of Syria's workforce was still employed in agriculture. So there are still major differences between these countries in terms of geographic size. As we see, Lebanon's much smaller, although large proportions of Syria are sort of desert-like and have very few inhabitants. Lebanon's a bit wetter. It's a fair amount richer. There are other ways in which they're different from each other, but they're alike enough in key respects, both carved out of sort of the Ottoman Empire and then later cleave from each other, have some measures of ethnic fragmentation that are similar. So imperfect cases for comparison, but cases nonetheless that I went with. And we can talk more about that. So my expectations for both experienced drought. There was perhaps higher state capacity in Lebanon compared to Syria, although I don't think that's as key a driver of differences in outcomes. I think the more key difference is highly exclusive regime in Syria, more inclusive in Lebanon, and that I wasn't certain that foreign assistance would matter all that much in either of these cases as sort of middle income countries, but my expectation was to the extent that it did, that Syria had less access to foreign assistance, and to the extent that Lebanon did, it would be distributed in a more equitable manner. So you get civil war in Syria, but you get protests, but no civil war in Lebanon. These were sort of my ex-ante sort of expectations going in. And I'm not a regional studies, like there will be people in this room who are expert in Syria or Lebanon, and I want to make sure that I have not done grave violence to these cases as I've written them up. So I welcome your comment. I had a Lebanese student of mine who said, yeah, let provided some context and make sure that there's more nuance in my interpretation of their historical record. And I'm doing the same in the other cases that I've written about. So these were my expectations going in. What does the evidence show us? First, we need to show that there's a drought. And the Kelly paper talks about this being the worst drought in 900 years, that the period from 1998 to 2012 was the driest 15-year period in the Levant in the last 900 years, that before the Syrian uprising that began in 2011, the Great Fertile Crescent experienced the most severe drought in the instrumental record. So these kind of are some scene setting. In the chapter, I go into rainfall deviations, looking at the agricultural growing season deviations. And here I've used October to May. I've seen other people use, say, October to March. I've used the rainfall deviations aggregated up to the national level, and we can talk about that as a choice, comparing that agricultural growing season to the previous 20 years, the average for the previous 20 years. And I accumulate that, so I basically show how much was this agricultural growing season rainfall total different from the average for the growing seasons for the previous 20 years. And so what you see is in 2008 that the rainfall levels in Syria were 123 millimeters below normal for the October-May period for the previous 20 years, or that average. And that was the worst decline since 1973. So there had been other droughts, but this was the worst one since 1973. And we can see some of the subnational distribution of that impact of that drought by looking at an FAO map for agricultural stress. So Hasaka governance in the northeast is the most severely affected. This is a core wheat growing region of the country. Also Raqqa and Aleppo in the sort of center north and then the northwest, the areas in red. Homs and Hama in the center part of the country have some red pockets, and then the far south, Daraa, Damascus, and Asweda are also have pockets of either high impact for agricultural stress or some of the intermediate ones. So there's some face validity here to think about. There was a severe drought in this period and has some particular geographic distribution. Lebanon, I do the same thing for Lebanon in terms of rainfall, which shows in 2008 that the rainfall was 204 millimeters below rainfall for the ag season compared to the previous 20-year average. Again, the worst since 1973. We can see the geographic distribution of that concentrated in the Bekaa Valley, the core agricultural wheat growing region of the country, on the sort of center south east of the country. Other governments in the country were also affected to some degree as well. In the chapter, I also look at temperature change compared to the previous 20 years, because some of these years might not have been low on rainfall, but were very high temperature increases, as high as almost 2 degrees centigrade above the average for that time of year, which could have a major bearing on crop production. And so this too shows that there was a comparable drought there was a severe drought in Lebanon around the same period of time. What impact did this have on food production? And so I look at just wheat production as a point of departure. So you can see wheat production over time. Between 2006 and 2008, wheat production in Syria declines by 60%. So not a good outcome. In Lebanon, you have the wheat production decline really showing up a little bit later in 2010, which was an especially hot year. And there's a 46% wheat production decline in 2010 compared to 2006, which I took as a sort of near peak year for wheat production. What then are the impacts on society? And here we already start to see a difference. So 1.3 million people in Syria were affected, 800,000 of them severely. Of those severely affected, 80% of those were living on diets of bread and sugared tea, which is basically 50% of the caloric content that people needed to kind of have a healthy life. 85% of their livestock was lost, and there were other social impacts that I talk a little bit about in the chapter. In Lebanon, I didn't really find many social impacts other than the price of food increased dramatically in 2008. And the price of food increased dramatically, not just because of production declines in Lebanon, but if you recall, this is around the time that there were other droughts happening in other parts of the world. And so global food prices increased dramatically during this period. And Syria had been a net wheat exporter up till 2006. Lebanon still imports, or had imported about 70% of all of its foodstuffs, including cereals. And so there were some differences between the two countries that made, I think, Lebanon more sensitive to food price increases rather than the production declines on the agricultural side. And we can talk about what that means in terms of the possibilities for conflict and protests. So we're already starting to see differences in the impacts, but those themselves might be a function of policy choices made by governments in the lead up to and in the aftermath of exposure to drought. And so these differences in outcome aren't solely a difference of physical exposure. I think they're also a function of the kinds of policies that governments had in place. And so that means we need to start looking through these other indicators of capacity, inclusion, and assistance. So on the capacity side, I start to look at the World Bank government effectiveness indicators. I look at some other indicators from the World Bank as well, but I'm just going to show you these. In 2007, Lebanon was at the 44th percentile rank for government effectiveness. Syria was at 22%, but you probably can't see this at a distance, but you can see in this chart of the trends over time that actually Syria between 2007 and 2009 is improving in government effectiveness, not declining. And I think how to understand this is that this particular metric is derived from investors who are surveyed about their attitudes towards the government. And Syria in 2005 launched a liberalization program, which I think external investors looked kindly upon and thought, this is a government that, because you had a kind of state socialist system in Syria that was one Bashar al-Assad, the son, took over in 2000, succeeding his father, tried to establish an identity as a modernizer and liberalizer. And so foreign investors looked at this and thought, this is great. Now, when you think about impacts on the ground in terms of what it means for farmers, it's in the way in which it's done, not so good, right? And I'll talk about that in a little bit. There are other metrics that are also derived from international investors from the PRS group that look at bureaucratic quality, which is actually this indicator is an ingredient in the government effectiveness metric of the World Bank. Shows a similar pattern that Lebanon's bureaucratic quality is higher than Syria's throughout this period, although Syria's does go up in this period. Again, I think investors are looking at this liberalization agenda and thinking this is going to work out well. But when you look at the actual policies in place in these two countries, and particularly subsidy policies, what you see is in the middle of the drought, Syria cuts its subsidies for fuel, on diesel fuel, and on fertilizers, which at that time were consuming about 4% of the GDP of the country. So there was a heavy expenditure that the government really couldn't afford any longer. But it sort of did it in a way that overnight, fuel prices quadrupled, and so it made it harder for farmers in May of 2008 to be able to use diesel fuel to pump and compensate for the decline in rainfall with irrigation. And irrigation had expanded and led to great problems for groundwater. That's a related but slightly separate story. They also later cut subsidies for fertilizers, which caused prices basically overnight to double. So it's hard for farmers to sort of compensate with additional agricultural inputs to try and keep production up. And so this leads to disastrous impacts. In the context of Lebanon, they maintain significant government expenses for subsidies. And when you look at the evidence, it's particularly on food price supports to keep bread prices, wheat prices for consumers from increasing. There's a little bit on the production side, but it's mostly for consumers, which leads me to believe that they were really worried about public protest from urban dwellers. And this is a more urbanized society than Syria, but that would have been a real risk to the regime at the time to have prices, which did go up by about 28%, to really explode and double like they did on international markets. The regime, and it spent something like $85 million on this. So they which was about 1% of the GDP of the government, 1% of the GDP on trying to blunt the, that sounds a little low. Anyway, to try and blunt the impact on consumers. I'll also look at in this chapter on water management institutions, not good in either country, so not really strong differences there. But tax revenue as a share of GDP, in the chapter I show that Syria's after kind of 2005-ish sort of drops dramatically. So their ability to extract revenue for tax collection, for service delivery, and for violence suppression goes down dramatically, whereas Lebanon stays about the same. So on capacity measures, I think we can clearly show that Lebanon was in better shape than Syria. But the real work, I think, in the chapter focuses on inclusion. And here I look at the ethnic power relations data set, which shows the degree of political representation in government. And here there are stark differences. 86% of different Syrian ethnic religious groups are excluded from political representation, dominated by the Alawites, who constitute 13% of the country. 86% is excluded. In Lebanon, only 13% of the populace is excluded, including 10% of Palestinians who are not even citizens of the country, right? They have an elaborate power sharing agreement that even dates back to the 1860s that hasn't always worked. So if you remembered from 1975 to 1990, Lebanon had a civil war of its own that has actually loomed quite large in the memory of most Lebanese. That may account for one reason why they have not lapsed into civil war subsequently. But there are elaborate sort of confessional representation mechanisms, both in government, but also in terms of government contracts, which has its own pathologies, but on some level has ensured that service delivery, contract delivery, that every different group gets their cut. And that leads to sort of inertia and problems in policy. They've had sort of periods without a government. They've also had Syrian occupation up until 2005, which is another but related story. It makes things messy. But I think the upshot is differences in the degree of political inclusion in terms of representation. And we see that in other metrics. So the Varieties of Democracy indicator for social exclusion, which tracks the degree of social exclusion for social services, shows Syria in green, much more exclusive, Lebanon more inclusive in red, and then still somewhat exclusive when you compare it to a country like Denmark, which is sort of my reference case of thinking about the literature on how to get to Denmark. People are familiar that Denmark is very inclusive. And in the chapter, I go through some of the other pathologies that have emerged with this sort of confessional system in Lebanon that's allowed elites to kind of divvy up the spoils of government to different sects within society, but maybe at the expense of the mass public. So on paper, it looks like an inclusive system that everybody's getting their cut, but the mass public is sort of getting cut out of this. So you're getting increasing levels of corruption. So if anybody's following the Lebanese case of late, they have had massive protests over, you know, lack of government services and pickup of garbage. And that's just a sort of symptom of this elite distance between different elites of different faith groups and mass society who is kind of fed up with stuff. So, but again, these are just two of the three dimensions. This focuses on, I focus on capacity and inclusion. We see on both measures that Syria is worse than Lebanon. We also have to think about what role foreign assistance played. And again, as I said before, neither of these countries is especially dependent on foreign aid or overseas development assistance. I contrast it with the Ethiopia case in green, which is a lot higher as a share of GDP. Both of these countries were relatively not dependent on foreign assistance in this period leading up to the drought. That said, Lebanon has a large diaspora, so as a share of GDP in green, this is Lebanon, again, compared to both of the other countries. So, and this may be a story that I haven't fully explored yet in this chapter, is what role remittances played in sort of blunting the impacts of, say, price increases on Lebanese society. I think the core difference that we start to see is there wasn't a drought appeal for Lebanon in this period. there was for Syria. And Syria had a drought appeal that through the UN for $20 million, of which only $5.4 million was made available. It wasn't funded. It wasn't fully funded. They did another one in 2009. About a third of it was funded. It was for $43 million. And the US did not contribute in either year because of political differences with the Assad regime. And that I think had a bearing on whether or not other countries wanted to contribute. So you had relative isolation of the Assad regime from international interlocutors that could have helped stave off some of the devastating consequences in the country. And you didn't have a drought appeal in Lebanon, but you did. So if people recall that the Israelis had a bombing campaign for 34 days in 2006 in southern Lebanon to try to take out Hezbollah, the sort of group that they regard as terrorists. And that led to an appeal in 2006, not drought related, but just they asked for $150 million and they got more than what they asked for. And then the next year, it wasn't fully funded, but they got nearly about half of what they wanted of $20 million, which to me suggests on some level Lebanon was a more, maybe there's differences in the nature. A drought appeal is less likely to secure something than something that's a response to a military campaign. Maybe there's differences there, but it also could be that Lebanon is regarded as more integral, accepted member of the international community in a way that Syria was not. So we still, though, need to link the story of impacts in the Syrian case to migration and to the civil war. So I want to take a couple more minutes and do that and then open it up for questions. So there have been numbers, you know, you're like, I can't read this. This text is so small. But the core idea here is that people have circulated numbers anywhere between 1.5 and 2 million people displaced in Lebanon, mostly from that, in Syria, mostly from that northeastern governorate of Hasaka, and going to southern cities like Drought in the far south, but also other urban areas. That number is probably wrong. That's surely wrong, right? But the numbers from the UN were 40 to 60,000 families, maybe 250,000 to 300,000 people. Crude estimates, I looked for lots of different estimates. I looked at a lot of the WikiLeaks cables that had some of the background information that the US Embassy and others were reporting at the time. And I come down with Tobias Ide has a paper in 2018, and he says, in sum, the figure of 1.5 million refugees used by Kelly et al., but also by Femi and Worrell, and Tubi Gleich and Worrell et al. Is almost certainly overstated, but is still very likely that several hundreds of thousands of additional people migrated from the drought-affected areas to the outskirts of urban areas. And so it's, at the end of the day, this is still a pretty significant number. Now, were these migrants involved in the conflict onset? There are studies out there that say they surveyed migrants. So Froelich has a paper that basically says, I talked to 40 migrants in these camps and none of them said that they were involved in the conflict. Other studies say, you know, I talked to these migrants and none of them said drought was an important reason for them moving. And so I think there's limited evidence that migrants participated in conflict, but maybe that doesn't matter. What really matters is if you have a large influx of people moving into an area, that puts stress on urban environments for service delivery, for employment, for housing, and people could be pissed off about that, right? And not too happy. So Deschâtel says whole families moved to Drought to live in tent camps. Drought in March 2011 is seen as sort of the locus for some of the early protests, if not the earliest protests in the country, where things kick off. Hinnebusch says in Drought, formerly a base of the Ba'ath Party where it began, the loss of work opportunities in Lebanon, corruption and drought had encouraged Salafism among unemployed youth. So we have some suggestive evidence. Do we have anything more? So Ash and Obradovic has a paper that just came out earlier this summer that uses an interesting strategy of nights at light, lights at night, nights at light, night, I have it backwards, lights at night. I always do that. It's a proxy for drought. So they basically look at areas that had a population decline and as observed by lights at night. So when the areas have less illumination, it's interpreted as a proxy for population decline. If it has more illumination, it's seen as population increase. And then they show the areas that had population decline had lower levels of conflict, and the areas, the Sunni Arab areas that had a population increase had more conflict. So this is one way that they're trying to tease out a connection, but then they do some qualitative evidence to say, okay, in the March-April 2011 period, what were people saying? What were the protests? And so they do a LexisNexis search. and they go through and they say that the political demands that people surfaced were not related to drought at all. And so they explain that by saying that the movement had to have been, or they surmise that it was Sunnis moving from one part of the country, moving to another part of the country, making common cause with fellow Sunnis in the south. And it was a Sunni uprising that was making common cause around political liberalization and not the drought per se. That's plausible. But you know, this is 2011. The drought is years earlier. And if you start looking at it, there were actually protests about the drought in the drought period. And if you look at Selby's study and others, they say that Drought wasn't actually the first protest, that there were others that preceded it. And so I'm not sure if we quite know or if we'll ever be able to know to tease out exactly how the drought impacted the mobilization leading up to the conflict itself. But I don't think we can easily throw it away in the way that Selby and their colleagues have done. And so I might want to do some more digging as I try and refine this chapter before publication, but this is where I am on it. Now, I'm going to leave out the Dewan and Bank reference for the sake of time. Let me talk through the alternative explanation. So one way you could say that, so Lebanon on some level doesn't have any of these social impacts precisely for the reasons that I talked about in terms of state capacity, their ability to use subsidies to attenuate the risk of social conflict, particularly on the consumer side with large price increases on food. But people could counter it and say, these cases aren't all that comparable. I mean, Lebanon's drought wasn't nearly as bad, see, or Lebanon's just so much richer and more urbanized, they're hardly good cases for comparison. But Lebanon has been on the verge of civil war for other reasons and still hasn't had one. They have had more than 1 million refugees come into their country since the start of the Syrian civil war, and they still haven't had one, and they've had new droughts since then. And so if you're saying that the drought wasn't severe enough to induce conflict, that's on some level accentuating the argument that drought is an important driver potentially of conflict itself. All they needed was a more severe one. So at the end of the day, I'm satisfied that the argument that I'm making about differences between the two countries in terms of governance, primarily on inclusion, but also on capacity, really explain the differences in their outcomes. But maybe I just want to see that because I have a whole book that's premised on that case. So what next? Why should and why do other states care about this? And I could talk about more of that in the Q&A, but that's what I'm going to write about next. I have a 2008 piece in Security Studies that sort of thinks about, from the US perspective, under what conditions would effects overseas affect US national security. And so we can talk more about that, or other states. But there's also this meta question of what then to do. What is the role of external interlocutors in improving state capacity or improving inclusiveness in other countries? Because if we look at the recent record of the international community in, I don't know, states like Afghanistan or Libya or Iraq, that record isn't exactly one that would give us much confidence that we know what we're doing as an international community there. On the other hand, if you look at the history of water sharing between countries with transboundary river basins, we actually have a rich empirical evidence that suggests that building institutions to manage environmental resources between countries can be done in a way successfully to diminish the risk of conflict. But we don't yet really fully know what that toolkit of actions that can be taken to diminish the risk of negative security outcomes inside countries. We have some ideas, when we think about FuseNet, Famine Early Warning Systems Network, and other measures to predict famines early and to try to intervene early to address food security problems, but I feel like we're at the beginning of that process of identifying a toolkit of strategies that can help countries avoid these negative security outcomes, both humanitarian emergencies and conflict. So I'll stop there and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
All right, so I guess we'll try to do the usual thing of I will try to keep a list of people who show hands and 2 fingers if you want to intervene. And if you would introduce yourself, that would be great. So just get us started.
Mike, I was interested particularly in your inclusion argument. Now, as we all know, global food shortages are predicted in a couple of decades or even earlier. that are more severe than what we've seen and more global, although uneven. Have you thought of ways to broaden your inclusion findings? I mean, you don't have any international data yet, except on water. How to broaden to the international scene, comparing a world where countries preserve their own diminishing food resources compared to a world where they're shared.
Great question. So around this time, Russia was facing a drought of its own and banned food exports, banned grain exports. And so that was one of the reasons why we had such a tremendous price increase in this period for global food prices. And I think that is the kind of beggar thy neighbor policy that we're worried about in a world of climate shocks. How do we have agreements in place to ensure that those kinds of unilateral policies are less likely to occur? Now, it's kind of hard to imagine that a Russia buffeted by its own production decline and having domestic food needs, would it ever, not impose a ban on food exports? Maybe they're unnecessary, that there's just, if you think about the classic argument from Amartya Sen, there's usually enough food around, it's the distribution of it that's problematic. And so I think what we need is we're not in an especially propitious moment for global agreements between the major powers, but on this, we need to have some conversations to ensure that those unilateral strategies of export bans are less frequent than they were, because otherwise we're going to have more Arab Spring-like settings, because it's inevitable that we're going to have food price shocks and volatility. So we have to have more cushions in place. The thing I didn't mention in the Syrian context is they sold much of their wheat reserves and so then we think about state capacity and just bad choices. They sold, if not all of their wheat reserves, half or more of their wheat reserves in the lead up to the drought because they were tempted by high international prices. And they made a strategic, ill-fated choice then, which meant they had less capacity to help their citizens out. And I don't know if international interlocutors were involved, because if you look at the World Bank, their reports were encouraging liberalization, but I think that they were discouraging dumb policies like that. And the international community should discourage countries from not having sort of insurance mechanisms in place so that they can avoid outcomes exactly like this one.
Hi, thank you so much. This was a really fascinating presentation. Melissa Carlson, pre-doc fellow at CSAC. I have two questions. So the first question focuses on whether, I would love if you could speak a little bit more about slow onset crises like droughts and famine versus quick onset humanitarian emergencies like a natural disaster or something like that. Just because I could imagine that the causal logic that links climate change and conflict outcome would change a little bit across those two instances. And I'm wondering if you could, I think it was in Nepal that like a sudden onset humanitarian, was it the 2015?
They had an earthquake,
But it forced like a peace agreement between warring parties, right? And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about kind of on the opposite of whether or not you think that maybe sudden onset disasters, slow onset disasters can create opportunities for cooperation that reduce likelihood of conflict outcome, even within the state itself among domestic actors. And then my other question is, I'm wondering if you could also speak a little bit more about resource distribution in Lebanon, just because it's not only the government, it's UNRWA, Hezbollah, you have these two other non-governmental actors that play a substantial role, and that seems to me that substantially differs from Syria, because UNRWA is not as active, they don't have as large of a Palestinian refugee population, there's no militant group that's providing services to a significant part of the country. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how you think that those differences might influence the conflict outcomes in both cases.
Right. That's a great question. So there's a literature on sort of disaster diplomacy that basically, and I think one of the cases that people often reflect on is the 2004 tsunami, which had differential effects, say in Indonesia and Sri Lanka. In Indonesia's case, you had the the effects were so dramatic that the combatants in Aceh weren't able to continue the fight, and so it led to a peace agreement, whereas in Sri Lanka it didn't, although you might argue that a couple of years later, the Sri Lankan government was able to crush the rebellion and end the civil war violently. And so I think there's an argument out there that very severe disasters, maybe swift onset ones, can facilitate the end of conflict if they are devastating for the combatants' ability to continue the fight. I think in this case, we're talking about the emergence of new conflicts, and I do think that that difference between slow and swift onset hazards is an important one, and I don't think I fully, I talk a little bit about it in some of the other chapters, but I'm not sure if I give it enough sort of analytical attention. And I think you're right. I think this resource distribution issue with Hezbollah, I started to look at that, and I don't think I've paid it enough attention. But on some level, you have my sense is, and this may not be fully true, is that on some level, the inability of the central government maybe to fully attend to different communities' needs is made up for by Hezbollah or maybe the UN efforts in the country. That should lead to legitimation challenges for the central government, but maybe it leads to some satisfaction among citizens because their needs are being met by somebody. And I think I need to explore that more and see if there's, either a narrative to build around it or more hard data. But I appreciate you bringing attention to that. Thank you.
Tom Finger, I'm a fellow here at FSI.
All right.
Thank you. I think this is great and badly needed. Reflect back 11 years ago when I did the estimate on.
Yeah, I was an external reader for that, so thank you for your work.
Well, we did it in order to give policy guys a head start to start thinking about what should be done to ameliorate and to respond to. And near as I can tell, absolutely nothing has happened.
Right.
But the work that you've described here is closer to that of the Academy of Sciences panel. I was on 1113,
okay.
Social stresses. And not as a critique, but as observations here. Size, we thought in the Academy of Sciences study, where most of the time we tried to figure out how do you actually get your arms around these problems.
Right.
And mostly we begged the question. But Lebanon's population, you can manage that externally with a food crisis.
Right.
Syria, you can't.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you plan the government policy disposal of the wheat reserves and what are the perceptions of the people of the likelihood that you get external assistance we thought mattered.
Right.
Another one was how long had it been since the last incidents of domestic turmoil? And by extension, having gone through the civil war in Lebanon, should have raised the threshold for being willing to undertake that kind of activity again.
Right.
Conversely, the learning done by the government on how do you manage this? How do you maintain a more inclusive arrangement and everything from distribution to who do you care for? That the decisions that governments made it kept coming up to us as these are really political. What are they prioritized?
Yeah.
What are they trying to protect? What do they not care about? What's the basic conflict? We couldn't answer these questions. So what I like about what you're beginning to provide a way to get at that system. So there's no real question there.
Yeah.
A compliment, but welcome comments on what I've observed.
There's no perfect paired cases, and when I come down to it at the end with these alternative explanations, on some level, it may well be true that the countries were different enough that, Syria's population size was so much larger than Lebanon's that managing that was going to be inevitably harder. Harder, but maybe not impossible. And so then the governance, critiques, I think, are still relevant. And some of these dimensions that you pick up on how long it had been since the last incident. I mean, so that 75 to 90 civil war in Lebanon, I think has has scarred the population and the leadership, that they're trying to avoid that if possible. And so that I think is tempered people's attitudes in ways that they haven't in Syria, which has a very young population, and people who have no memory of, say, the 82 protests that were crushed by Assad the father. In the sort of, it's hard to get at these sort of ineffable qualities of learning by the government, which don't really get fully captured in sort of data sets of government quality. And so you have to sort of get at that a little bit through maybe World Bank metrics or some of the WikiLeaks cables or things that people who are closer to the process may have some knowledge of. But I'm hopeful that those kinds of estimates are the kinds of things that practitioners regularly would be doing to get a feel for how vulnerable different countries are, because we can produce sort of early warning data sets based on sort of some configuration of pretty crude indicators, but you need to have more detailed country level expertise. And that's why it's so important for us to have both a well-funded intelligence apparatus that has deep regional expertise on places of concern, but also a State Department that is fully funded or more fully funded, and that has the kind of expertise and continuity and leadership that respects expertise, so that they can do their jobs and reflect back, so that we're ready and prepared and better poised to make good decisions on issues like external aid. Although some of these, if we were to go back in time, would we made a different choice on contributing to that 2008 effort that the Syrians asked for drought assistance? Maybe we would or could or should have, and rerun that tape of history, we might be in a different situation now.
Hi, Karthika Shashikumar. I have a question and a comment.
Yeah.
So, are these two cases independent? Because you mentioned 1 million people moving from Syria to Lebanon. So, just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. And then, as you were speaking, you started off with the term capacity, state capacity.
Yeah.
But then the index was of effectiveness, which I think is related, but kind of a different concept. So you can have a state that's highly capable at killing ethnic minorities.
Yeah, right.
It's not really effective in
Right.
delivering, what the state's supposed to be doing. And then you also use the term governance, which again is related to these two, but it's somewhat different. So I think I'd love to hear how you kind of differentiate these three and how you see them as being linked.
Those are great questions. So I mentioned in passing that Lebanon had an occupation on some level from Syria itself, that after the civil war that Syria had a say in Lebanon over leadership until 2005. And then you had, after that moment, the prime minister was assassinated, there was a lot of hullabaloo, Syria withdrew, and a lot of Syrian workers that seasonally would go to work in Lebanon didn't have that as an opportunity anymore. And so you're thinking about these cases are more intertwined on some level, and certainly the later 1 million Syrians end up in Lebanon, and so that they're linked to each other, that makes them seen as sort of paired cases that are separate from each other, somewhat problematic. But it'd be even harder to say compare Syria to, say, I don't know, Armenia or some other country outside the zone that has different history and different rainfall patterns, different kind of crop season. So imperfect cases for comparison, but suffer through it nonetheless. I went ahead. On this capacity measure, that's great question. So in the Ethiopia case, in the 1980s, they're generally seen as having poor government effectiveness, but they were on some level highly capable of rounding people up and moving them off their lands into camps. And so, my judgment was that they were, it's hard to, they did the wrong thing effectively, right? And so it's hard to know how to measure that. So these measures from international investors on effectiveness say, they're not very effective, but they were capable in the sense of doing something very dumb. And so it's a bit hard to think about how to categorize that, other than saying it's hard to kind of capture that in a good data set, because all the data sets that we have available that do this on a cross-country level are imperfect proxies for the phenomenon that we're ultimately trying to represent. So the only way to layer that is with additional, discussion of subsidy policy and the like, that I hope gives it a little bit more flavor than just like here's the number on the chart. Marshall?
Hey, Marshall Burke, MSI and Shoulder Sciences. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah.
In these sort of paired case studies, how do you think about omitted variables? And you've touched on this a little bit, but when you run a regression, you're always worried about omitted variables, what's sitting in your error term that could be correlated with both your treatment and your outcome, right?
Right.
So here, what is low state capacity correlated with that's unobserved that can also affect, the conflict outcomes that we see? And the thing that jumps to mind here, and this was, I think, salient since people have been running these cross-sectional regressions, think back to the old Kieran Layton paper, right?
Yeah.
Right, the strongest predictor of seeing conflict in cross-section is low per capita incomes, right?
Right.
Or differences in per capita income.
Yeah.
And so here, Lebanese incomes are 4 times Syrian incomes
Yeah.
in 2018, according to the World Bank website that I just looked at.
Yeah.
Right? And so if you think of people's ability to deal with shock, it's what the government can do for you, but it's also what you can do for yourself. Right?
Yeah.
And if we take per capita incomes as a summary statistic, then the Lebanese are 4 times as able to do something for themselves.
Right.
When a shock hits. So what do you do about that?
So here I think income distribution and where the impacts are felt matter. So the Bekaa Valley is the poorest part of the country. And so on some level, in aggregate, I think that's surely true of Lebanon. And so that may matter as one reason that there's greater coping capacity. We also see we see that on remittances, although that may be consistent with some of the argument I made about the role of assistance. But I think that you can, if we rely just on the statistics about, country level averages, it may do violence to the geographic distribution of where the effects were. In the Bekaa Valley were many poor farmers were affected by that, although that should have shown up in outcomes in terms of food security and other things that I didn't really see. And the government seemed mostly attuned to food price shocks in urban areas. And so then then we're into debates about, the role that food price shocks play in protest movements in different kinds of regime types. And it's a slightly different set of arguments that Cullen Hendricks and others have made about the vulnerability of regimes. And usually we think that authoritarian regimes who are worried about regime turnover from those kinds of protests would be more inclined to provide insulation from urban dwellers. But Lebanon is a sort of intermediate case. It's not fully democratic, not fully authoritarian. And so we would almost expect to see more protests emerge in those kinds of regimes without the kinds of state intervention that we saw in Lebanon. But Lebanon intervened, and so it's like we see the sort of absence of the kind of protest movements, at least over food in that moment, but we have seen it in other things of late, this may be a departure from your original question about omitted variables, but I do think is significant in that the response of the regime in Syria to the protests in 2011 was to murder people, whereas the response of late in Lebanon to the protests that have come onto the streets in 2019 is to basically let it go and try and keep it peaceful, which allows a public outlet for expression, which is sort of under the rubric of inclusiveness, but is more about voice opportunities. But I do think it's the kind of voice opportunities that are important for people aside from whether or not they're formally represented in government. And so anyway, that's a more long-winded answer of thinking about this is hard to do in a way that that tells a clean story without doing violence to the cases, which are more complex than my stylized narrative can inevitably be.
Emily Myerton, faculty member at the Naval Postgraduate School, and pre-doctoral fellow here many moons ago.
All right.
So I'm trying, thanks first, I'm really excited about this project. I think I'm trying to figure out what the takeaway is from your chapter, and I haven't finished reading it, about climate change and conflict.
Yeah.
Because the factors that you're identifying, the low state capacity and the exclusive institutions and sort of foreign aid as a substitute for state capacity.
Yeah.
Like, we already know these things are associated with conflict.
Right.
So then is climate change a necessary condition of this argument to get to conflict in the Syria case, or
Right.
is it, because could we argue that, for example, that when the protests erupt in Drought, then that's enough, even without the climate migrants, because of low state capacity and weak and exclusive institutions. So I'm trying to tease out a little bit more about what role climate change. I can see how those factors create a humanitarian emergency in one case and not the other one, but I'm less clear on the conflict mechanism.
Right. So I think this gets at the kinds of conversations that Selby and others have talked about, where the challenge is you know, like Homer Dixon would say, can you tell the story of the conflict without mentioning the drought? And if you can't, you have to include it, right? And so then the question is, well, how far back do we go? And this is far enough back that you might think, well, maybe it wasn't that relevant. On the other hand, it was just a couple years prior, like, you know, so if you have a 4-year drought that ends in 2010 and the conflict starts in 2011, do we say it wasn't relevant? I mean, I think that's a harder one to exclude, whereas if it was a drought that happened in the 80s, which is what a lot of people did over Darfur, they said, oh, Darfur is the first climate war. And then you go, well, when was the drought? And it was like in 1984. And you're like, well, I mean, you're explaining the conflict in like the early 2000s based on a drought that happened 20 years earlier? I don't think so. That's a really, that's a much more attenuated causal chain that it has to go through all sorts of other societal effects. And so I think in the Syrian case, it's harder to make the claim because it was more close in temporal proximity. But other cases where people are trying to stretch and make that contorted argument like Ban Ki-moon did, I'd be hard pressed to defend that one. But I would here because I wrote a chapter about it. So,
so actually next on my list is a question from an online list.
Oh, wow.
Yes. So this is from Garrett Adler, who's a PhD student in our program here. So he says, thinking about foreign efforts, based on this case or others you've already explored, what do you think could be the efficacy of foreign aid for compensating for weaknesses in capacity? More broadly, how do you conceive of the interactions between your three main moderating variables? Are they complementary? Do they operate separatively, additively, or what?
So my former colleague, Jennifer Bissell, who's now at UC Berkeley, has done some great work looking at national natural disaster preparedness and looking at under what conditions do countries do more and other countries do less, and how that intersects with foreign aid. Because one worry is that foreign aid becomes something that leads to moral hazard, where governments don't do enough because they are waiting on outside actors to do something in their stead. And in the African context, she found that wasn't really true, that careful efforts by USAID and other donors to make sure that it was complementary, so that states had to invest in some of their own resources alongside external resources to build capacity, were effective in avoiding the moral hazard trap. And you know, the Ethiopian case is an interesting one where it's hard to implant that sort of leadership in countries unless they have developed it already. And so, you know, it's an interesting phenomenon that you had a cohort of people in Ethiopia coming out of their civil war that were public-minded and wanting to provide services for their population. And so the role of external assistance allowed them to do something that they weren't able to accomplish on their own. In other country contexts, you don't have far-sighted leaders, and so that offer of foreign aid, even if it's conditional, isn't seized upon in a way to build state capacity that by hook or by crook, they're going to figure out how to wangle it to, you know, end up in some offshore bank account. And so how do you know who you're dealing with as a sort of trustworthy interlocutor? I don't know how to, you know, imagine how you know that without having a better idea of the personalities of the people you're involved with in different country contexts. But in many instances, it's maybe hard to know that ex ante. And you maybe have to sort of see if they do a little bit that looks like it's worthy of confidence, and then sort of gradual trust building measures. But that's hard to do in an emergency setting when people need a lot of help. I don't know if that's a good answer for this question, but as you think about, I'd have to give it some more thought about additive versus complementary. But I hope I'll try and respond to them online later to give them a better answer on that piece of the question.
I'm Sig Hacker here at Seaside. I do mostly nuclear things, so
Right.
I don't think much about these issues, but you certainly make one think in some detail about these. A short question, then followed by another one. The social exclusion is interesting, and I found your index interesting. You know, with Denmark being down around the 2% mark. What's the number for the United States?
I'd have to look at that indicator for, I would imagine it's closer to Lebanon. I mean, it's certainly not very equal, but you could look at, I don't know, other things like Gini index or Lorenz curves. I mean, we know that inequality is rampant in this country. So whether or not it's services are delivered in a biased manner in the same way as I think that indicator is trying to get at, I'm less clear. That I'll have to look.
The more serious question, you know, I find it interesting as you try to relate to the causal factors.
Yeah.
State capacity, the ability, and how they would distribute foreign aid, and also the form of the government. You know, I can't help but think, how do you factor in the amount of foreign meddling, of foreign interference? It would seem to me that, you know, that certainly that could affect the way the foreign aid is distributed, could affect to some extent, you know, the state capacity. It could override in some cases almost everything else that you look from an internal standpoint. So how do you factor out that sort of a variable?
Yeah, on some level, it's figured into the relationship over aid itself, but it doesn't encompass all dimensions of foreign interference, like the Syrian occupation or, you know, Israeli bombing campaign in Lebanon. But one of the things that struck me in the Somali and the Ethiopia case, for example, is that, you know, the reputation of al-Shabaab in that case, in sort of the lead up to the drought in 2011 that killed some 260,000 people in Somalia, was in the 2009 period, the al-Shabaab militia denied foreign aid actors' ability to deliver services in southern Somalia. But when you look at the case, what actually happened alongside that is that the US government decided under the Patriot Act that aid agencies wouldn't be allowed into the country without at risk of being charged under the Patriot Act with supporting terrorism. And so not only did you have al-Shabaab denying actors access to aid, but you had the US government denying entry into the country in the first place. And so the choices of the aid donors to provide aid or not can be critical, independent of whether or not they're going to invade or something like that. In this instance, they kept actors out of the country in the same way that the U.S. signaled in 2008 and 2009, you know, we don't agree with this regime's policies, and so we're not going to contribute to this drought effort. And that proved problematic because there wasn't enough external effort to alleviate the suffering of the people in that context, and we see where it went.
Yeah, just follow up quickly. One other thought that I had, I deal a lot with trying to understand North Korea, and I know that's a totally, you know, different world than the one that you're talking about here. But they also had a really serious drought.
Yeah.
And actually, droughts fires back in the mid-1990s
Right.
or so. So have you looked at all as to how any of these thoughts and the models would apply to how North Korea responded at the time?
I haven't, but I think that would, again, be indicative of a country that denied foreign aid in, had low state capacity, highly exclusive, and whether or not it was denial of the aid or the U.S. and other international actors didn't want to provide aid, I think it would fit very well and be a good companion case to show on its own, because that it fits these dynamics quite well.
Well, North Korea has high state capacity for repression.
Yeah. Right, and this gets to the question that you raised earlier about, you know, the conflation of capacity and effectiveness. I mean, yeah, low state capacity with respect to service delivery, maybe. And so I think what we have to do is move beyond just the broader metrics like government effectiveness to look at capacity in the domain where it's relevant. And so I guess the question is, if North Korea had wanted to deliver vast amounts of aid to the populace to defray the risks of famine in that period, would they have been able to? Because they have high capacity for repression, but do they actually have the service capacity to get food to people to make sure that they don't die? And that I'm not sure, but I think that ambiguity in the way I presented the material, especially when we're looking at metrics of effectiveness at the national level, doesn't quite get at the dynamics that are relevant to the domain here, which has to do with food.
Oh, which one?
Yeah, a couple of things. One, building off of Sig's question. Among the things we wrestled with was with respect to climate change, was what you needed to know and look at to get out in front to reduce vulnerability in different dimensions. And that we determined was different than what you would need to do to increase resilience, capacity to respond. And that was different yet from a disaster response.
Right.
And what you've described is basically it happened. That there was a drought and there was a civil war.
Right.
And what do we do now?
Right.
And the capacity of systems, how do you intervene?
Right.
When every year we would go through the U.S. foreign aid kind of stuff,
Right.
respond to the U.S. doesn't provide enough, and country after country, you conclude you couldn't put any more in the system.
Right.
That it couldn't handle it. So what kind of state capacity should one attempt to enhance so that you either reduce vulnerability, increase resistance, or make it possible to intervene in the way? An observation on the North Korea, once they decided that they would accept aid, they did a pretty good job getting it distributed.
Okay.
The problem was they pretended they didn't need it for way too long. So
right.
The capacity to be a repressive regime doesn't automatically mean you can't distribute if you decide to do so. The final one has to do with who's next door. To the countries for, do you care if migrants leave your country? I think part of what Syria was doing to just kill them wasn't simply to repress demonstrations, it's to give people an incentive to get the hell out of Dodge.
Right.
Reduce the problem by letting them go next door.
Yeah.
And then it's somebody else's problem. How we would respond to that depended very much on whether we thought that migration was going to be destabilizing to a country and economy and interest that we cared about. And then take the we and multiply it multiple times in the international system. That you underscore how hard this is to translate into a strategy for preparing and mitigating the effects of climate change that are clearly coming at us much faster than systems are able to take research results and translate it into policy.
Right. Those are great observations. So one of the things that I think we need a better understanding of is common risk factors for different kinds of hazards. So Nina von Exkull and I did a paper sort of off the shelf kind of rough cut in foreign affairs, where we looked at what we thought were some of the emergent findings in this field that with relationship to agricultural risks and conflict and humanitarian emergencies. It's countries with a history of conflict in the last 5 years. It's countries with high agricultural dependence and countries that have high political exclusion. We put those together, and there were 20 countries that had at least 2 of those criteria. Sahel band to the Middle East, Yemen, Afghanistan, some of the familiar countries. And then we coupled that with some iSciences data on emergent water deficits, both in the current, in the previous 9-month period and projected out over the next 12 months. And that gave us, of those 29 were, looked like they were at risk of problems. Now that was a kind of rough and ready. There's been other work that has like a new water index that New America has released that has like 80 indicators in it. I feel like that is less useful Like if we thought that these, I think we want to do some out of sample predictions, but if we thought that from these 3 indicators that we could develop a sort of risk index that tells us, like, be worried about these countries over the next 9 to 10 months, and they have these core attributes, that gives us something to work with in terms of early warning systems. And we have other things like that that are more complex, say on the famine side, but we also have a set of instruments that we know, pretty specific interventions that we can do in terms of pre-placement of food or having food for work schemes or cash transfers on the food side to make sure that people don't die with famine. Now, we need other sort of ready set of instruments that are targetable that we could do, and I'm not sure what that means when we're thinking about the longer chain to conflict. Is it sort of a rapid action crew for conflict resolution over resources that the Norwegians and other Scandinavians like send a team of Norwegians over there because they seem to have some secret sauce of being able to allay local groups' fears over resource sharing. Whatever it is, I think we need to have a better sense of specific instruments that are tailored. And we know what those kinds of risks are in the cyclone setting, right? It's early warning systems, it's shelters so that people can get up above ground. And so those are sort of the metrics of capacity that are tailored to particular hazards that can at least avoid large-scale loss of life to these hazards. But then can we translate that on to other kinds of conflict outcomes when we start to think about emergent violence between, say, pastoralists and agriculturalists over grazing lands and water. The last thing I say is that the point you raised about how ill-prepared we are, we're making extrapolations or based on past patterns of climate anomalies, and we're entering a world in which the severity and the geographic location of these kinds of events are so different from the human experience that I mean, we could do the kinds of work that, Saul Shang and others have done to say, like, looking out to 2040, what's the temperature going to be in this particular locale? We're just in for a world of hurt and surprises like we've seen with Hurricane Harvey in my neighborhood, where I don't know how we fully prepare for that without doing a whole bunch of sort of stress test, worst case scenarios, and then thinking about, well, what's the 500-year flood that we need to prepare for that's actually going to happen 3 times in the next 10 years? So,
simultaneity.
Right. Yeah.
My name is Norman Amark. I'm in the history department here.
Yeah.
Here at CSAC. And thank you for a very interesting presentation. Perspectives are interesting, especially if you think in historical terms. Right. You tend to be kind of looking out into the future, and just the last remarks, how do you predict this and how do you do this? But if you would look back sort of on the conflict in history, in Syria, in a historical sense, and even if you were to do a kind of comparative history, of Lebanon and Syria, I still am not 100% sure where you would put climate change in that comparative history in terms of its salience, the outbreak of the conflict. Right. And then not just the outbreak of the conflict, but the duration of the conflict. It's still going on, right? In other words, conflict. I mean, you're talking a lot about outbreak of conflict, but you don't, as far as I can tell, think about how long it's gone on. Right. The intensity, the number of refugees, number of people killed, the fact that it's still not solved, the fact that it could have been, looking back, or even looking back as an historian, you could have said, well, it's another Arab Spring, and it could have been solved if Assad had gotten out and something else had happened. Right. So how do you think about it from that kind of perspective? So most of this literature in the climate conflict work is focused on conflict onset, and hardly anybody's done anything on conflict duration. I don't do that here either, but so I was reading something from a Carnegie Center that was basically saying, look, the agricultural sector in Syria since the civil war started has suffered from a number of problems, not least of which is the ongoing violence, which makes it hard for agriculturalists to plan and plant. But there's also been subsequent droughts that have made it hard to recover food production. So there's that. And
this is less climate related, but I'm reviewing a paper now that's sort of consistent with the arguments that other people have made about how in wartime, agricultural regions that are rich become contested zones for, who's going to be able to feed their armies, right? And so then it becomes like an area in a climate constrained world, the areas that are agriculturally rich regions may be further limited. And so the areas of contestation may be concentrated on those fertile territories, and that becomes a locus for the fighting itself. And so I think we're only at the beginning of the exploration of conflict duration and intensity and how it relates to climate. And so if there are people in this room who want a new research project, there is an opening there that I haven't filled, that hardly anybody else in this space has yet really worked on.
Can I just follow up very quickly? So I noticed this says why climate change matters more than anything else.
Right.
Would you say that about the Syrian conflict?
No.
Figure it out exactly what you're saying.
So this was a piece that I did in Foreign Affairs that they put the title on it. So they wanted me to say something provocative about why climate change is important in terms of shaping the 21st century. So it was more forward-looking, and this was the title they put on it. But it gets at this issue of what's the appropriate response from the international community if we think that these kinds of dynamics are going to increasingly shape world history moving forward. But the title, I'll live with it.
Syria, do you think?
No. But again, I don't think that qualitative case study methods, and like my advisor was Andrew Bennett, and he did this book with Alex George on process tracing. And the thing that was inculcated to me as a graduate student is that qualitative case study methods don't do a good job at assessing relative causal weight. And so what we can do is establish the scope conditions, but we can't really say this mattered that much relative to that, especially if it's multi-causal and overdetermined. Or so on some level we can say, well, if the drought had happened after the conflict started, it would be hard to make the case that it had a causal role in it. At least we have temporal contiguity that it happened beforehand, so at least it's suggestive that it mattered, and we try and trace it through.
That's one of the worst historical fallacies there is, by the way.
Yeah, a relative causal weight.
Something happens
before, and
then something comes afterwards.
Yeah, no, but
that's number one historical fallacy.
Well, I mean, you got to do some more work than that, but you can definitely rule something out if it happened after the thing started, right?
I'm actually going to insert myself here because my question relates a little bit to part of what Norman was saying. So the Arab Spring does not make much of an appearance in your chapter, your presentation, and I kind of wonder about that because, at some level, as somebody as I was watching this all unfold, I mean, the fact that there were protests in Syria, they followed on the heels of protests everywhere else.
Right.
And in fact, at the time I was writing in my textbook, revising the textbook, and I wrote a thing about the Arab Spring. You get protests everywhere, and the outcome was very different. So in Tunisia and Egypt, you get leaders ousted, and in Lebanon, in Libya, you got a civil war. And then I wrote, and in elsewhere, the protests were just repressed, and that was the end of it, as in Bahrain and Syria.
Right.
Because it certainly looked like that was what was going to happen. There were protests, the Arab Spring protests in Syria, the regime was going to crack down. That was going to be the end of it. Fortunately, I had many opportunities to revise that passage before it actually appeared in print, because eventually Syria turned into a civil war. And in some ways, that's the real puzzle is, why did, you would not have expected Syria to turn into a civil war. Of all the places. And so it seems like, so first of all, it's to your, can you tell the story without the drought? It seems to me you can certainly start to tell the story of the onset of the protests without the drought. And then the real question is, does the drought help explain the puzzle of why this thing that should have been easily repressed by, in fact, a very effective repressive regime, in fact, snowballed out of control?
So this gets back to this issue of the effects of the drought itself on state capacity, or the decline in state capacity that happens alongside the drought. In that, I mentioned earlier that in the chapter I have a table of tax revenue as a share of GDP, and it declines dramatically in this period. And I think what you see is the state's ability to do service delivery and repress violence declines. And so on some level, there, because in 1982, there was a big protest movement, and Assad the father crushed it, right? It wasn't hard. I mean, it was hard, but it wasn't, they were able to do it. And I think it has to do with the repressive capacity. And so how do you tie that, in an environment where if we don't have really good records of taxation or the specific taxation that we get from agriculture relative to other things. I may need to try and tease that out a little bit more carefully, but I do think that's suggestive of why they weren't able to put this to bed. But there were also other choices that the regime made, which was related to the fact that they couldn't afford the subsidy regime that they had, that had developed over decades. In that, they were spending 4% of their GDP on these subsidies in the midst of the drought, and so 2.6% on diesel subsidies alone, and they were just hemorrhaging money. And so they were giving farmers all this money, and other groups, and they made a series of choices to withdraw in the agricultural space, in the health space, and in education. And there were a lot of sort of lower middle income groups affected by those choices that heretofore had been sort of nominally, regime supporters. And so you basically cut off your, even in an exclusive regime, they cut off a key source of social support that they couldn't recover from because they didn't have the resources to buy them off anymore. I think that is, partially the story of why they couldn't put the protest to bed.
This is back to the question of international inclusion. I guess it's a remark as much as a question. Typically in today's world, and dealing with questions of food distribution and the like, we separate distributional issues from capacity issues. In the world where we're headed, it's quite likely that there are going to be eventually limits on carbon emissions.
Right.
And it is going to be one of the last places where it's hard to think of a substitute for hydrocarbon use is in the international shipping.
Right.
You're not going to make them all nuclear, not soon anyway.
Right.
So that links distributional issues with capacity issues increasingly. And that's always struck me as something that's going to happen. Do you have any comments on that?
I know that Maersk, one of the major shipping companies, is pledged by 2050 to have a carbon-free fleet. But that would mean that we'd have to have major improvements in electrification and batteries. Like we're starting to see it in trucks, but it's it's short distance stuff like in your city buses. They get charged every night. So I'm not sure what the technological advances are going to be between now and 2050. It may be like other sectors where they're buying credits from other places to be carbon neutral, but they're still running off hydrocarbons. But yeah, that is going to be one of the challenges.
That has to be prioritization.
Right, or just fertilizer production itself, which depends on hydrocarbons. I mean, we're not going to go organic and feed 8 billion people or whatever it is now. We're going to have to figure out some way of continuing to produce fertilizer to produce sufficient food for all of the bodies that need it.
Big, do you want the last question?
Yeah, I just want to point out an intersection between your world and my world.
Okay.
In Syria, September 2007. The Israelis bombed a nuclear reactor that was being built in Syria by the North Koreans. Were you aware of that at all?
I know of Osirak in 1982 in Iraq, but I didn't know about the Syria one. Yeah.
No, so in Syria, in 2007, the North Koreans were building them a nuclear reactor. Yeah. That nuclear reactor was specifically designed to produce plutonium, which eventually, you would think they're going to have a nuclear weapons program. Yeah. What was interesting, the Israelis bombed it, and the reaction of the Syrians was amazing. And so then what made me think, when you said in 2008 they asked, for drought assistance from the international community, well, it turns out in 2007, when the Israelis bombed this reactor, the Syrians said, "What reactor?"
Right.
There was nothing. Nothing happened. They essentially made no protest of the fact that the Israelis wiped this out. The Syrians cleaned it all up and said, there was nothing there. So it was interesting. If they hadn't done that, I wonder whether their request for assistance might have actually been different.
Yeah, lots of reasons why people didn't like Syria at the time. I don't know.
All right, I think we've come to the end of our time. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming.